The golden gates of Ravencrest Palace gleamed under the morning sun as Queen Consort Isabella walked through the marble corridors. Her silk gown rustled softly against the polished floors, and her diamond tiara caught the light streaming through the tall windows. She had been Queen Consort for barely 3 months since marrying King Alexander, yet she already felt the weight of suspicion following her every step. Isabella paused before the portrait gallery, studying the faces of previous queens. Each woman stared back with painted eyes that seemed to judge her worthiness. She touched the emerald necklace at her throat, a gift from Alexander on their wedding day. The precious stone felt cold against her skin, much like the reception she had received from the royal court. The palace servants whispered behind closed doors about her humble origins. Isabella had been born in a small village outside the capital, the daughter of a blacksmith. Her beauty and intelligence had caught the attention of nobles at a harvest festival, eventually leading her to court where she met the then Prince Alexander. Their love story had captivated the kingdom, but not everyone celebrated their union. Captain Marcus Thornfield, the head of the palace guard, watched Isabella from the shadows of a stone archway. His weathered face bore the scars of countless battles fought in service to the crown. He had served the royal family for 25 years, first under the old king and now under Alexander. Marcus prided himself on his loyalty and his ability to sense danger before it struck. Something about the new Queen Consort troubled him deeply. Strange visitors had been seen entering her private chambers after midnight. Letters with foreign seals arrived for her weekly, delivered by messengers who refused to give their names. Most concerning of all, valuable items from the royal treasury had begun disappearing. Small pieces at first, then more significant treasures. Marcus had brought his concerns to King Alexander twice, but the young monarch dismissed them as jealousy from the old guard. Alexander was deeply in love with his bride and refused to hear any criticism of her character. This blind devotion worried Marcus more than any enemy army ever could. In her private study, Isabella carefully read a letter written in a code she had learned as a child. The message was brief but urgent. Her brother Victor needed more money to fund their family's secret political movement in the neighboring kingdom of Valdris. The revolution they had planned for years was finally within reach, but it required gold and lots of it. Isabella folded the letter and held it over a candle flame until it turned to ash. She had married Alexander partly for love, but mostly for access to the wealth and power needed to help her people overthrow the tyrant king of Valdris. Her village had been destroyed in a raid 5 years ago, and her parents had died defending their home. The marriage was her chance for revenge and justice. The young Queen Consort opened a hidden drawer in her ornate desk and removed a small velvet pouch. Inside were 3 ruby rings from the royal collection, each worth enough to buy weapons for 100 soldiers. She had been careful to take only pieces that would not be immediately missed, but she knew her time was running short. A soft knock at the door made Isabella's heart race. She quickly hid the pouch under some papers and called for the visitor to enter. A young maid named Sarah stepped inside, curtsying deeply before speaking. "Your Majesty, Captain Thornfield requests an audience with you in the throne room," Sarah said nervously. "The king is waiting there as well." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. Alexander rarely conducted formal business in the throne room, unless the matter was of great importance. She thanked the maid and took a few moments to compose herself, before making the long walk through the palace corridors. The throne room was an imposing space with soaring ceilings and massive columns carved from black marble. Tapestries depicting the kingdom's glorious history hung from the walls, and hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across the floor. King Alexander sat on the golden throne that had belonged to his ancestors for 3 centuries. His face grave and unreadable. Captain Thornfield stood at attention beside the throne, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. Behind him, 6 palace guards waited in formation, their armor polished to a mirror shine. The formal arrangement of people in the room told Isabella that this was no ordinary meeting. As she approached the throne, Isabella noticed that Alexander would not meet her eyes. His jaw was clenched and his knuckles were white where he gripped the armrests of his throne. The man who had whispered words of love to her just that morning now seemed like a stranger. "Isabella," Alexander spoke her name without the usual warmth. "Captain Thornfield has presented me with some very serious accusations regarding Your conduct as Queen Consort." The room fell silent except for the crackling of torch flames and the distant sound of wind through the tall windows. Isabella felt as though the floor might open beneath her feet, but she forced herself to remain calm and dignified. "What accusations, my lord?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. Marcus stepped forward and bowed to the king before speaking. "Your Majesty, we have evidence that the Queen Consort has been stealing from the royal treasury and possibly passing state secrets to foreign agents." Isabella's mind raced as she considered her options. She could deny everything and hope that Alexander's love would protect her, or she could try to explain her actions and appeal to his sense of justice. Either choice could lead to her downfall. The weight of her hidden past pressed down on her shoulders like a stone. The revolution in Valdris was so close to success and her people were counting on her support. But standing in that throne room, facing the man she had grown to truly love despite her original intentions, Isabella realized that her carefully laid plans were crumbling around her. Alexander finally looked at her, and she saw pain in his eyes that cut deeper than any blade. The boy who had fallen in love with a village girl at a harvest festival was gone, replaced by a king who had to choose between his heart and his duty to the crown. The silence in the throne room stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Isabella's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it echoing off the marble walls. Captain Thornfield reached into his leather pouch and withdrew several pieces of evidence that would seal her fate. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of loyal service, "3 nights ago, I personally witnessed the Queen Consort meeting with a hooded figure in the Eastern Garden at midnight. They exchanged what appeared to be a small package." Alexander's face grew paler with each word. He had dismissed Marcus's earlier warnings as paranoia, but the captain's detailed account was difficult to ignore. The king's hands trembled slightly as he gestured for Marcus to continue. "Furthermore," the captain continued, producing a small piece of parchment, "this coded message was found hidden in the Queen Consort's private chambers during a search conducted this morning. Our cryptographers believe it contains information about troop movements and treasury reserves." Isabella recognized the partially burned letter she thought she had completely destroyed. A tiny corner had survived the flames, and apparently it contained enough coded text to raise suspicions. Her mind raced through possible explanations, but each one seemed more desperate than the last. The young Queen Consort lifted her chin defiantly, drawing upon the strength that had helped her survive the destruction of her village and the loss of her family. She would not cower before these accusations, even if they contained more truth than she cared to admit. "These are serious charges." "Captain Thornfield," Isabella said, her voice ringing clear through the vast chamber. "But accusations require proof, not suspicious interpretations of innocent activities." Marcus nodded grimly and gestured to one of his guards, who stepped forward carrying a wooden chest. The captain opened it to reveal several pieces of royal jewelry that had recently gone missing from the treasury. Among them were the 3 ruby rings Isabella had hidden in her desk just hours earlier. "We found these hidden in Your Majesty's private study," Marcus announced. "Each piece has been reported missing over the past 2 months. The combined value would be enough to fund a small army." Alexander stood slowly from his throne, his royal robes falling around him like a heavy mantle of responsibility. The man Isabella had married seemed to age years in the span of moments as the weight of betrayal settled upon his shoulders. "Is this true, Isabella?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Have you been stealing from our treasury?" For a moment, Isabella considered maintaining her innocence. She could claim the jewelry had been planted in her chambers by enemies at court. Many nobles still resented her common birth and rapid rise to power. But looking into Alexander's eyes, she saw not anger but profound hurt, and she found she could not lie to him about this. "The jewelry is mine," she admitted, causing gasps to echo through the chamber. "But not for the reasons you believe." Several courtiers who had gathered to witness the proceedings whispered among themselves. News of the Queen Consort's confession would spread through the palace within the hour, and beyond the walls before sunset. Isabella knew that her words in this moment would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the fate of hundreds of people in Valdris who depended on her support. Alexander descended the steps from his throne slowly, each footfall echoing like thunder in the silent room. When he reached Isabella, he stopped just close enough that she could see the tears threatening to spill from his eyes. "Then tell me the truth," he said quietly. "Tell me why my wife, my queen, has been robbing the crown that she swore to serve." Isabella took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. The revolution in Valdres would have to succeed or fail without her stolen gold. Her love for Alexander, which had grown far beyond her original calculating intentions, demanded honesty. "My village was burned by King Roderick of Valdres 5 years ago," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My parents died in that attack, along with dozens of innocent people. My brother Victor leads a resistance movement trying to overthrow Roderick's tyrannical rule." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled court. Valdres was not technically an enemy of their kingdom, but everyone knew of King Roderick's brutal reputation. Several nobles nodded in understanding, though their expressions remained guarded. "I married you partly for love," Isabella continued, looking directly into Alexander's eyes, "but also to gain access to resources that could help my people achieve freedom. The gold was meant to buy weapons and supplies for the revolution." Captain Thornfield stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. "Your Majesty, this confession proves that the Queen Consort is a foreign agent working against our interests. She has used her position to steal from the crown and potentially compromise our security." Alexander held up a hand to silence the captain while keeping his gaze fixed on Isabella. The young king was struggling to reconcile his love for his wife with his duty to protect the kingdom. The weight of the crown seemed heavier than ever as he considered his options. "You say you acted for love of your people," Alexander said carefully. "But what of your love for me? What of your oath to serve this kingdom and its interests?" Isabella felt tears beginning to form in her own eyes as she realized the impossible position she had created. "My love for you is real, Alexander. It grew beyond anything I expected or planned. But I cannot abandon the people who still suffer under Roderick's rule." The throne room erupted in whispered conversations as courtiers debated the implications of the Queen Consort's confession. Some argued that her noble motivations made her actions understandable, while others insisted that theft was theft regardless of the reasons behind it. Marcus cleared his throat loudly, bringing silence back to the chamber. "Your Majesty, the law is clear in cases of treason and theft from the royal treasury. The punishment is imprisonment or exile, regardless of motivation." Alexander closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, Isabella saw that the loving husband had been replaced by the king. The transformation broke her heart, but she understood that he had no choice but to prioritize his duty to the crown and the kingdom. The morning light streaming through the throne room windows seemed to dim as King Alexander wrestled with the most difficult decision of his young reign. The assembled courtiers waited in tense silence, their eyes moving between their king and the woman who had captured, his heart only to break it so thoroughly. Alexander walked to the great window that overlooked the palace gardens where he had first kissed Isabella under the moonlight just 4 months earlier. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else's life now, a fairy tale that had turned into a nightmare of political intrigue and divided loyalties. "Captain Thornfield," the king said without turning around, his voice carrying new authority that surprised even himself. "What would you advise in this situation?" Marcus straightened to his full height, feeling the weight of his responsibility to both serve his king and protect the kingdom. "Your Majesty, the evidence of theft is undeniable. The Queen Consort has confessed to stealing royal property and using her position to aid a foreign political movement. By law and precedent, she should be arrested and tried for treason." A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. The word treason carried with it the possibility of execution, a fate that seemed unthinkable for the woman who had so recently been celebrated as the kingdom's beloved Queen Consort. Isabella stood perfectly still, her chin raised in defiance even as her world crumbled around her. She had known this moment might come, but she had hoped that love and understanding might prevail over law and tradition. Looking at Alexander's rigid posture by the window, she realized that hope had been naive. "However," Marcus continued, surprising everyone in the room, "I would also note that the Queen Consort's actions, while illegal, were motivated by a desire to help innocent people suffering under a tyrant's rule. King Roderick's cruelty is well documented, and his attacks on defenseless villages are acts of barbarism." Alexander turned back to face the assembly, his expression unreadable. The courtiers watched him carefully, knowing that his decision would set a precedent for how the kingdom handled matters of the heart versus matters of state for generations to come. "Lord Chancellor," Alexander addressed an elderly man with a white beard, who served as the kingdom's chief legal advisor. "What are my options under the law?" The chancellor stepped forward, his ceremonial robes rustling as he moved. "Your Majesty, you have several choices. You could order the queen consort's immediate arrest and trial for treason. You could choose to exile her from the kingdom. Or, given the unusual circumstances, you could invoke royal mercy and impose a lesser punishment." Isabella watched Alexander's face as he considered these options. She could see the internal struggle playing out in his features, the battle between his duty as king and his love as a husband. Part of her wanted to make this easier for him by accepting whatever fate he chose, but another part of her still hoped for understanding. "There is another matter to consider," Alexander said slowly. "The kingdom of Valdris and King Roderick. If what Isabella says is true about the suffering of innocent people, perhaps we should examine our own policies regarding our neighbors' internal affairs." This statement sent ripples of excitement through the court. Several nobles who had investments in Valdris trade routes looked nervous, while others who had always opposed King Roderick's brutal methods nodded in approval. Captain Thornfield frowned deeply. "Your Majesty, intervening in Valdris's internal affairs could be seen as an act of war. King Roderick has a powerful army and several allied kingdoms. So you would have us ignore the suffering of innocent people to avoid inconvenience?" Alexander asked sharply. "Is that the kind of kingdom we wish to be?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everyone present. Isabella felt a surge of pride for the man she had married, even as she faced the possibility of losing him forever. This was the Alexander she had fallen in love with, the one who put justice above convenience. Lord Pemberton, an influential duke with considerable wealth and political power, stepped forward from the group of observing nobles. "Your Majesty, while we all sympathize with the plight of Valdris's people, we must consider the precedent of allowing foreign agents to operate within our borders, even well-intentioned ones." "The Queen Consort is not a foreign agent," Alexander replied firmly. "She is my wife and a citizen of this kingdom. Her actions were misguided, but her loyalty to suffering people is admirable." Marcus sensed the king wavering and decided to present the harsh reality of their situation. "Your Majesty, regardless of the Queen Consort's motivations, she has broken the law. If you fail to act decisively, other nobles may see it as weakness. They might conclude that personal relationships can override justice, which could undermine your authority." Isabella finally spoke, her voice clear and strong despite the tears she was fighting back. "Alexander, Captain Thornfield is right. You cannot let your feelings for me compromise your duty as king. I knew the risks when I chose this path." The young king looked at her with eyes full of pain and admiration. Even facing possible execution, she was thinking of his welfare and the stability of his reign. This only made his decision more agonizing. "I need time to consider all aspects of this situation," Alexander announced. Captain Thornfield placed the Queen Consort under house arrest in her chambers. "Post guards, but treat her with the respect due her position. No one is to speak with her without my express permission." Marcus bowed deeply. "It will be done, Your Majesty." As the guards moved to escort Isabella from the throne room, she caught Alexander's eye one last time. In that brief moment, they communicated volumes without words. Her eyes told him that she understood his impossible position, and that she would face whatever came with dignity. His eyes told her that his love remained, even if his duty demanded they be separated. The great doors of the throne room closed behind Isabella with a sound like thunder, and Alexander found himself alone with his advisors and the weight of a decision that would define his reign. The boy who had fallen in love at a harvest festival was gone forever, replaced by a king who must choose between his heart and his crown. Outside the palace walls, news of the Queen Consort's arrest was already spreading through the capital city like wildfire. Some citizens expressed shock and disbelief, while others claimed they had always suspected something was amiss. In the taverns and marketplaces, people debated whether love could excuse treason, and whether their young king had the strength to do what duty demanded. 3 days had passed since Isabella's arrest, and the palace felt like a tomb. King Alexander had barely slept, spending his nights pacing the corridors and his days in endless meetings with advisors who all had different opinions about what should be done with his wife. The weight of the crown felt heavier with each passing hour. In her chambers, Isabella sat by the window watching the gardens where she had once walked freely as Queen Consort. 2 guards stood silently by her door, their presence a constant reminder of her changed circumstances. She had refused all meals except water and bread, not out of self-pity, but because the rich foods of the royal kitchen reminded her too much of her lost position. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Captain Thornfield entered, his expression softer than it had been in the throne room. Behind him walked Sarah, the young maid who had always been kind to Isabella despite the whispers of other servants. "Your Majesty," Marcus said formally, though his voice lacked its usual harsh edge, "the king has sent me to inform you that your trial will begin tomorrow morning in the High Court." Isabella nodded calmly, though her heart clenched at the finality of those words. "And what charges will I face?" "Theft of royal property and conspiracy against the crown," Marcus replied. "The maximum penalty for these crimes together is death, though the king has the power to show mercy if he chooses." Sarah stepped forward nervously, clutching a small bundle in her hands. "Your Majesty, I brought you a change of clothes for tomorrow, and I wanted you to know that many of the servants believe you are trying to do good." Isabella smiled at the young woman, touched by her loyalty. "Thank you, Sarah. That means more to me than you know." After they left, Isabella sat alone with her thoughts as darkness fell over the palace. She thought of her brother Victor and the resistance fighters in Valdres who were probably still waiting for supplies that would never come. She thought of her destroyed village and her parents' graves that she would never see again. Most of all, she thought of Alexander and the love they had shared before duty and politics tore them apart. Meanwhile, in his private study, King Alexander stared at a portrait of Isabella that had been painted on their wedding day. In the painting, she looked radiant and hopeful, her eyes bright with dreams of their future together. The artist had captured something in her expression that Alexander now realized was a mixture of love and determination. A messenger arrived with urgent news from the kingdom's spies in Valdres. King Roderick had launched another brutal attack on a border village, killing dozens of innocent farmers and burning their crops. The report included detailed descriptions of the atrocities that made Alexander's stomach turn with disgust. "Sir," the messenger said hesitantly, "there are also reports that a resistance movement in Valdres has grown stronger in recent months. They claim to fight in the name of justice for all the villages Roderick has destroyed." Alexander dismissed the messenger and walked to his window overlooking the kingdom he was sworn to protect. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the chimneys of his subjects' homes. These people trusted him to make decisions that would keep them safe and prosperous. But what about the people just across the border who suffered under a tyrant's rule? The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching the somber mood that had settled over the palace. The High Court was filled with nobles, officials, and selected citizens who had come to witness the trial of their queen consort. Whispered conversations filled the air as people speculated about what the king would decide. Isabella entered the courtroom wearing a simple blue dress that Sarah had brought her, her head held high despite the chains around her wrists. She looked neither left nor right as she walked to the defendant's chair, focusing instead on maintaining her dignity in what might be her final public appearance. King Alexander sat on the judgment throne, a smaller version of his royal throne designed specifically for legal proceedings. His face was a mask of official neutrality, but those who knew him well could see the pain in his eyes as he looked at his wife. Lord Chancellor Williams stood to read the formal charges. "Isabella of Ravencrest, Queen Consort of this realm, you stand accused of theft of royal property valued at over 10,000 gold crowns, and conspiracy to aid foreign political movements against the interests of this kingdom. How do you plead?" Isabella rose gracefully to her feet, her voice clear and unwavering. "I plead guilty to taking the jewelry, Your Honor, but I deny that my actions constituted conspiracy against this kingdom's interests." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Many had expected her to maintain her innocence or at least argue for lesser charges. Her straightforward admission of guilt shocked even her harshest critics. The prosecution began presenting evidence, including the recovered jewelry, witness statements about her midnight meetings, and analysis of the coded letters found in her chambers. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of systematic theft and possible espionage that seemed damning even to Isabella's few supporters. When it came time for Isabella's defense, she stood again and addressed the court directly rather than speaking through a legal representative. "Your Honor, And noble citizens of this court, I will not insult your intelligence by denying the facts that have been presented. I did take those jewels. I did meet with representatives of the Valdris resistance. I did these things not for personal gain, but to help innocent people who suffer under King Roderick's tyrannical rule. She paused, looking around the courtroom at faces both sympathetic and hostile. 5 years ago, King Roderick's soldiers destroyed my village simply because we refused to pay his impossible taxes. They killed my parents in front of me, burned our homes, and left the survivors to starve. I survived that attack, but I never forgot the screams of the innocent or the smell of burning homes. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Tales of King Roderick's cruelty were well known. But hearing a first-hand account from someone they had come to know as their queen made the stories more real and immediate. When I learned that my brother, Victor, was organizing resistance fighters to oppose Roderick's reign of terror, I wanted to help, Isabella continued. Yes, I used my position as Queen Consort to access resources. Yes, I broke the law. But I did it to give hope to people who have no other champions. King Alexander watched his wife speak with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Even facing possible execution, she spoke with passion about justice and protection for the innocent. These were the same qualities that had made him fall in love with her, and they were now the same qualities that might force him to condemn her. The prosecution's closing argument focused on the importance of law and order, the danger of allowing foreign influences in the royal court, and the precedent that would be set if crimes were excused based on good intentions. The courtroom listened intently, weighing justice against mercy in their minds. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as King Alexander rose from the judgment throne to deliver his verdict. Every person present understood that this moment would be remembered in the kingdom's history for generations to come. The young king's decision would not only determine Isabella's fate, but also establish what kind of ruler he intended to be. Alexander looked out over the assembled court, his gaze taking in the faces of nobles who had served his father, common citizens who had been selected to witness the proceedings, and the woman he loved sitting in chains before him. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that surprised even his oldest advisors. This court has heard evidence of crimes committed and confessions freely given. Alexander began. The law is clear about the penalties for theft from the royal treasury and conspiracy with foreign entities. However, the law also grants the crown discretion in matters where justice and mercy must be balanced. Isabella watched her husband with eyes that showed no fear, only acceptance of whatever fate awaited her. She had spoken her truth and defended her actions with honor. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage that had helped her survive the destruction of her village. Queen, Consort Isabella has admitted to taking royal property valued at 10,000 gold crowns, the king continued. This theft cannot be excused or ignored regardless of the motivations behind it. The crown's resources belong to all citizens of this kingdom, not to any individual's personal causes, however noble they might be. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the courtroom from those who believed strict adherence to law was essential for maintaining order. Captain Thornfield nodded approvingly, though his expression remained somber. However, Alexander said, his voice growing stronger, this court has also heard testimony about the suffering of innocent people in our neighboring kingdom of Valdris. We have been presented with evidence of King Roderick's systematic cruelty toward his own subjects, including attacks on defenseless villages. The shift in the king's tone caught everyone's attention. Some nobles who had investments in maintaining peaceful relations with Valdris looked nervous, while others who had always opposed King Roderick's methods leaned forward with interest. The question before this court is not simply whether laws were broken, Alexander declared. The question is what kind of kingdom we choose to be. Do we ignore the suffering of innocent people to maintain convenient political relationships? Do we turn our backs on justice when it becomes inconvenient? Lord Pemberton stood up from his seat among the noble observers. Your Majesty, while we all sympathize with the plight of Valdris's people, we must consider the practical implications of involving ourselves in a neighboring kingdom's internal affairs. Alexander turned his attention to the Duke, his expression stern. Lord Pemberton, my father often spoke of the responsibility that comes with power. He taught me that a crown is not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a burden to be carried in service of what is right. The king stepped down from his elevated position and walked closer to Isabella, close enough that he could see the tears she was fighting to hold back. When he spoke again, his words were directed to her but meant for everyone present. Queen Consort Isabella, your actions violated the law and broke the trust placed in you as a member of this royal family. For this you must face consequences. However, your motivations were rooted in a desire to protect innocent people from a tyrant's cruelty. This speaks to a character that values justice over personal comfort. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She could hear something in Alexander's voice that gave her hope, though she dared not let herself believe what she thought she was hearing. Therefore, Alexander announced, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom, I hereby sentence Queen Consort Isabella to immediate exile from this kingdom, with the understanding that she may never return while I live. The stolen property will be replaced through her personal holdings and any remaining debts will be forgiven. The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations and heated discussions. Some nobles applauded the mercy shown, while others protested that the punishment was too lenient for such serious crimes. Captain Thornfield looked surprised but not displeased with the king's decision. Furthermore, Alexander continued, raising his hand for silence, I am announcing that this kingdom will no longer maintain diplomatic relations with King Roderick of Valdres. Any trade agreements or mutual defense pacts with his regime are hereby dissolved. This second announcement sent even greater shockwaves through the assembly. Lord Pemberton and several other nobles who profited from Valdres trade looked genuinely alarmed, while common citizens who had heard stories of Roderick's cruelty nodded in approval. Your Majesty, Lord Pemberton protested, this decision could have serious economic and military consequences for our kingdom. King Roderick has powerful allies who might view this as an act of aggression. Alexander faced the Duke squarely, his young face showing wisdom beyond his years. Lord Pemberton, if we are threatened for refusing to associate with a tyrant who murders innocent villagers, then we will face that threat with honor. I will not have this kingdom's prosperity built on the suffering of defenseless people. Isabella felt her heart swell with pride and love for the man she had married. Even in the act of banishing her, he was showing the courage and moral clarity that had first attracted her to him. She understood that his decision was the only one that allowed him to balance justice with mercy while maintaining his authority as king. Your Majesty, Isabella said, rising to address the court one final time, I accept your judgment and thank you for your mercy. I ask only that you remember the people of Valdres in your prayers, for they have no other champions in this world. Alexander's composure finally cracked slightly as he looked at his wife for what would be the last time. I will remember, he said quietly, and I will pray that someday justice will come to those who need it most. Captain Thornfield stepped forward to escort Isabella from the courtroom, but Alexander held up a hand to stop him. The Queen Consort will be given 1 hour to gather her personal belongings and say her farewells. She will then be escorted to the border with a guard of honor, as befits her former station. As Isabella was led from the courtroom, she turned back once to look at Alexander. Their eyes met across the vast space filled with nobles and citizens, and in that moment they both understood that their love would endure, even though their marriage could not. The great doors closed behind her with finality, and King Alexander stood alone with the weight of his decision and the knowledge that ruling justly sometimes required the greatest personal sacrifice. The boy who had fallen in love at a harvest festival was truly gone, replaced by a king who had chosen duty and justice over personal happiness. 6 months had passed since Isabella's exile, and the kingdom had settled into a new reality under King Alexander's increasingly confident rule. The young monarch had grown into his role with remarkable speed, earning respect from both his subjects and neighboring kingdoms for his principled stance against tyranny and his commitment to justice. The palace corridors, that had once echoed with Isabella's laughter, now rang with the sounds of military planning and diplomatic meetings. Alexander had assembled a coalition of 3 neighboring kingdoms who shared his opposition to King Roderick's brutal methods. Together they were providing sanctuary and supplies to refugees fleeing Valdres, much to Roderick's fury. Captain Thornfield entered the king's private study carrying dispatches from their network of spies and sympathizers. The relationship between the king and his guard captain had grown stronger since the trial, built on mutual respect for difficult decisions made in service of justice. Your Majesty, Marcus said, bowing formally before approaching the desk where Alexander studied maps of the border regions. We have received word from the Valdris resistance movement. Their leader wishes to meet with you personally to discuss formal alliance. Alexander looked up from his maps, his face bearing new lines of responsibility that had not been there a year ago. Their leader? Do we know anything about this person? Marcus smiled slightly, the first time Alexander had seen such an expression on the stern captain's face in months. According to our sources, the resistance leader goes by the name Victor the Liberator. He is said to be a skilled military tactician who has united several scattered rebel groups under one banner. The name Victor sent a shock of recognition through Alexander. Isabella had mentioned her brother Victor multiple times during their conversations about her destroyed village and her family's fate. Could this resistance leader be the same person his exiled wife had been trying to help? Arrange the meeting, Alexander decided quickly. But not here in the palace. Choose a location near the border where we can speak privately, without drawing attention from Roderick's spies. 3 days later, Alexander rode with a small escort toward the abandoned monastery near the Valdris border. The building had been deserted for decades but provided perfect cover for a secret meeting. As they approached, Alexander saw figures waiting in the shadows of the ancient stone structure. A man stepped forward from the group of resistance fighters, and Alexander's breath caught in his throat. The resemblance to Isabella was unmistakable. Victor had the same intelligent eyes and determined set to his jaw that had first attracted Alexander to his sister at the harvest festival so long ago. "Your Majesty," Victor said, bowing deeply but keeping his eyes fixed on the king's face, "I am honored that you agreed to meet with us." "Victor," Alexander replied, dismounting from his horse and approaching with only Captain Thornfield as escort. "I believe we have much to discuss, not least of which is your sister." Victor's expression softened at the mention of Isabella. "Isabella wrote to me about your kindness in showing her mercy when you could have imposed the ultimate penalty. Our entire movement is grateful for your compassion." Alexander felt a pang of longing at the mention of his exiled wife. "How is she? Is she safe?" "She is well, Your Majesty, and she has become one of our most effective organizers. Her education and experience in your court have proved invaluable in securing support from sympathetic nobles in neighboring kingdoms." Victor paused, studying the king's face carefully. "She speaks of you often, always with great affection and respect." The two men talked for hours, sharing intelligence about King Roderick's military movements and discussing strategies for providing aid to refugees and resistance fighters. Victor proved to be exactly as Isabella had described him: intelligent, passionate about justice, and completely dedicated to freeing his people from tyranny. "Your Majesty," Victor said as their meeting drew to a close, "I must ask something personal. Isabella told me that you banished her to preserve your authority as king, but that your heart remained with her. Is this true?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the hills that separated his kingdom from Valdris. "Your sister chose to sacrifice her position as queen to help people she had never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. How could I not love someone with such courage and conviction?" Victor smiled, the expression transforming his weather-beaten face. "Then perhaps you should know that she never stopped loving you either, even when she thought you might order her execution." As they prepared to part ways, Victor extended an invitation that would change everything. "Your Majesty, in 2 weeks we are planning our largest operation yet against one of Roderick's supply convoys. If successful, it could provide enough weapons and gold to arm every resistance cell in Valdris. We would be honored to have your support and—" He paused meaningfully. "Isabella will be there to help coordinate the logistics." Alexander's heart raced at the possibility of seeing his wife again, but his mind immediately began calculating the political risks. If he were discovered actively supporting the Valdris resistance, it could be seen as an act of war that might endanger his own kingdom. Captain Thornfield, who had been listening silently to the entire conversation, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if I may offer my counsel?" Alexander nodded for him to continue. "Sir, you once told me that a crown is not a privilege to be enjoyed but a burden to be carried in service of what is right. Sometimes serving what is right requires taking risks that seem unwise to more cautious minds." The king looked at his most trusted advisor with surprise and gratitude. Marcus had come to understand not just the political necessities of the situation, but the personal cost that duty had exacted from his young monarch. 2 weeks later, Under cover of darkness, King Alexander rode with a small force of volunteers toward the Valdres border. They wore no royal insignia and carried only personal weapons, officially making this a private expedition rather than a royal military action. As they approached the rendezvous point, Alexander's heart pounded with anticipation and nervousness. He was about to see Isabella again, to fight alongside her for the cause that had cost them their marriage but revealed the depth of their shared values. In the distance, he could see campfires marking the resistance gathering point. Somewhere among those fires was the woman he loved, the woman who had chosen justice over comfort and had inspired him to do the same. Tonight, for the first time since her exile, they would stand together again in service of what was right. The boy who had fallen in love at a harvest festival was truly gone, but in his place stood a king who understood that true love sometimes meant fighting together for something greater than personal happiness. As Alexander spurred his horse toward the lights ahead, he knew that whatever the future held, he and Isabella would face it with the same courage and conviction that had brought them together in the first place.